The wedding invitation arrived on a gray Wednesday, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a utility bill I didn't want to open. I almost threw it away without looking. The envelope was thick, creamy, with embossed lettering that felt too fancy for someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. My cousin, getting married for the third time. I hadn't been at the first or the second. This felt less like a celebration and more like an obligation wrapped in gold foil. I stared at the RSVP card for a long time, pen hovering over the little line that asked for my name plus one. My stomach twisted at the thought of going alone, being seated next to someone's chatty aunt or judgmental uncle, fielding the inevitable questions. Why are you still single? What happened with that last guy? Have you considered therapy or, worse, dating apps? Family gatherings had a way of stripping me down to nothing but a set of assumptions and timelines I'd failed to meet. I didn't want to explain myself again. That night, I sat in bed with the invitation resting on my stomach like a weight. My apartment was quiet, dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. I thought about how tired I was of defending my life, of pretending to be okay with being the curiosity at the table. I wanted to go, not to celebrate love, but to reclaim space. But I didn't want to go alone. I didn't want to be the story they whispered about over cake. The idea came suddenly, wild and a little ridiculous. Her face popped into my mind without invitation. Warm brown eyes, that sly half-smile she always wore like a secret, her laugh that cracked the air open in any room. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer. Life had swept us in different directions. But I remembered the way we used to talk late into the night, the way we'd shared hotel rooms during work trips, the way she once reached across the table to fix the collar of my blouse like it meant something. I picked up my phone and stared at her name for a full 5 minutes before tapping out the message. It felt impulsive, desperate even, but also right in a strange, heart-thudding way. When her reply came back almost instantly, I laughed out loud. 3 words, simple and sure. I'm in, let's play. My heart jolted. This wasn't just a plan, it was a spark. In the days leading up to the wedding, I caught myself overthinking everything. What would we wear? Would anyone believe it? Did it matter if they didn't? I cleaned my apartment twice, bought wine I never drank, and stood in front of the mirror practicing what I'd say if someone asked how we met. It wasn't that I wanted to deceive anyone. I just didn't want to explain why the truth felt so incomplete without her beside me. She arrived the night before we were supposed to leave, suitcase in hand, smile crooked, eyes lit with mischief and something softer beneath. Seeing her again after all that time felt like inhaling after holding my breath for too long. We hugged in the doorway and I felt her body against mine, warm and solid and real. Her scent was familiar, something like sandalwood and clean cotton, and it settled into my skin like a memory I hadn't realized I'd missed. We spent that night drinking tea and going over our story. We didn't need much. Our past was already full of shared experiences, inside jokes, weekends away, late-night calls after bad dates. All we had to do was shift the lens, reframe what already existed. I noticed the way she leaned toward me when she laughed, the way her fingers brushed my knee when she reached for her mug. There was an ease to it, a rhythm we never really lost. The next morning, we packed the car and hit the road just after sunrise. The drive was quiet at first, filled with soft music and the hum of the tires on pavement. Then came the stories, the laughter, the comfortable silence that wrapped around us like an old blanket. She rested her foot on the dashboard, sunglasses perched on her head, and I caught myself glancing over more than once, noticing, remembering. As we neared the venue, my stomach tightened again. The elegant farmhouse stood against a backdrop of rolling hills and blue sky, looking like something out of a wedding magazine. Guests mingled in clusters, dressed in pastels and floral prints, laughing with champagne flutes in hand. I could already feel their eyes, the weight of their curiosity, the way they would catalog and compare. We stepped out of the car and she reached for my hand without hesitation. It was just a gesture, one meant for show, but it landed like a tremor under my ribs. Her fingers laced with mine naturally, as if they'd done it 100 times before. I felt heat crawl up my neck and forced a smile, trying to ignore how good it felt. Introductions came in waves. Cousins, aunts, family friends with names I barely remembered. We moved through them like dancers in a well-rehearsed routine. She laughed at their jokes, complimented their outfits, leaned into me when I stumbled through awkward conversations. Her presence made everything easier. Her touch made it harder to remember this was all pretend. That night in our shared hotel room, I sat at the edge of the bed and watched her move around the space like she belonged in it. She kicked off her heels, pulled her hair into a messy bun, and tossed her jacket onto the chair with the same ease she tossed compliments across the room. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I turned off the light and slid under the covers, listening to the quiet rustle of her settling in beside me. The darkness didn't feel empty. It felt charged. She was close, just inches away, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding for reasons I didn't yet understand. Or maybe I did, and just didn't want to say it out loud. We were pretending to be a couple. That was the plan. But something about the way her breathing slowed beside me made it feel like we were pretending too well. The reception hall was bathed in golden light, with crystal chandeliers glinting overhead and long tables draped in white linen lined with centerpieces of roses and eucalyptus. A string quartet played in the background, their music barely audible over the low hum of conversation and laughter. I clutched my glass of champagne and felt her hand at the small of my back, guiding me gently toward the crowd. It was supposed to be comforting, a gesture meant for appearances, but my skin tingled beneath her fingers. We were already deep into the game, and it was working. People watched us. I felt their gazes slide over my shoulders and settle on us with a mix of curiosity, surprise, and thinly veiled judgment. Some smiled too widely, others avoided eye contact altogether. The family had always been conservative, cautious, preferring silence over confrontation, and now we had dropped a silent bomb in the middle of their floral-scented event. But no one said a word. Instead, there were nods, half-hearted compliments, 2 sweet smiles. They didn't know how to place us, which made it easier to keep the illusion alive. We sat together during dinner, elbows nearly touching, knees occasionally brushing under the tablecloth. I watched her cut her food with slow, deliberate precision while she listened politely to the conversation around us. Her fingers tapped the rim of her glass, her foot rested near mine, and I couldn't focus on the plate in front of me. Every nerve felt alert, watching the way she tilted her head when she laughed, how she leaned in to speak to me, even though we had nothing new to say. The closeness felt rehearsed but natural, and I hated how easy it was to sink into it. The photographers made their rounds, asking couples to pose, and when they reached our table, we didn't hesitate. She slid her arm around my shoulder, and I leaned in, smiling through the pulse that beat rapidly in my throat. Her touch was gentle, casual to anyone watching, but my body registered every millimeter of it. The click of the camera shutter felt like a spark igniting something just beneath my skin. When she pulled away, I felt the ghost of her hand for long seconds after. Dancing started shortly after dessert. The first dance belonged to the bride and groom, slow and sentimental, but it wasn't long before the floor filled with other couples. I hadn't intended to join. I planned to sit with a second glass of wine to observe from a safe distance. But then she reached for me, offering her hand with an arched brow and a slight smile that said, "Why not?" I let her lead me to the floor, heart thudding, the world narrowing down to just the space between our bodies. The music was too fast for a slow dance, but we moved together anyway, swaying more than stepping, our rhythm deliberately off from the song. She kept one hand on my waist, the other loosely clasped in mine, and I rested my free hand on her shoulder, fingertips brushing her neck. Our faces were close, too close. I could feel her breath when she laughed softly, smell the faint trace of wine on her lips. I focused on a point just past her ear to keep from staring directly into her eyes. I was afraid of what I might see there, or what she might see in mine. We danced longer than we should have. Song after song passed, and we never left the floor. It wasn't just for them anymore. It became something else, an unspoken conversation, a wordless confession unfolding between glances and touches. I felt the weight of her gaze every time our eyes met. I felt the pressure of her hand at my back, the way her fingers would curl slightly, as if she didn't want to let go. It wasn't performance, not anymore, and that terrified me. At one point, we moved toward the edge of the floor to catch our breath, and she leaned in to whisper something into my ear. I didn't catch the words, only the heat of them against my skin, the way her mouth brushed my earlobe, the quiet hum that settled in my chest afterward. Someone walked by and smiled knowingly at us. Another guest gave me a thumbs up. I nodded back with a practiced grin, but inside I was unraveling. We had become a spectacle, a curiosity, and no one knew that pretending had started to feel like the most honest thing I'd done in years. Later, we returned to our table and found a small crowd waiting. Cousins I barely remembered, their spouses, friends of the groom. They made room for us, asked questions, complimented us on how perfect we looked together. She answered with ease, telling stories we hadn't planned, but which sounded real anyway. She spoke about how we met, how long we'd been together, how we made each other laugh. I played along, nodding at the right moments, adding details as if they were memories and not inventions. My hand stayed on her thigh beneath the table, her fingers occasionally brushing mine. We kept up the act, and no one seemed to notice the fraying edges between what was pretend and what was not. As the night wore on, the buzz of wine and attention dulled the ache in my chest. I laughed too loudly at a joke. I let my head fall onto her shoulder during a toast. She kissed my temple once, light and casual, but it sent a jolt through my body like lightning. I knew how this looked to everyone else. We were the couple they hadn't expected, but now couldn't stop watching. Two women so at ease with each other, so close. They saw love, or something that looked like it. But they didn't see the chaos beneath it, the fear, the confusion, the silent war in my head. They didn't know how many times I had caught myself staring at her lips, her hands, the slope of her collarbone where her dress dipped low. They didn't hear the pounding in my ears or the way my breath hitched when her leg pressed against mine under the table. They didn't see the way she looked at me when no one else was watching. When the party began to die down and people started slipping away, I realized I didn't want the night to end. I didn't want to go back to the room and face the quiet, the closeness, the possibility of what might come next. But more than that, I didn't want to break the spell. Out here, under the fairy lights and the soft music, we were something beautiful, something believable, even if it had started as a lie. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to go back to pretending it wasn't real. The morning light seeped in through the thin hotel curtains, turning the edges of the room a pale, dusty gold. I lay on my side, eyes open, staring at the back of the woman beside me. The sheets were tangled around our legs, The air smelled faintly of her shampoo and the remnants of wine, and the silence was thick with all the things we hadn't said. I could hear her breathing, slow, steady, unaware, or maybe deliberately pretending to be asleep. My own body felt foreign, like I had borrowed it from someone else just for the night and wasn't quite sure how to wear it in daylight. I stayed still, afraid that even the smallest movement would wake up the truth we had been tiptoeing around for hours. The events of the night before played behind my eyelids like an unfinished scene, looping over and over in fragments. Her hand on my back as we walked through the lobby, the warmth of her skin brushing mine as we undressed in silence, the way her eyes searched my face just before the first kiss. We hadn't spoken when it happened. No hesitation, no permission, just a pull, like gravity, like breath. Her body had fit against mine too perfectly, her mouth tasting of something sweet and wrong, her touch deliberate but not demanding. There had been heat, yes, but also something terrifyingly tender. I had kissed her like I had something to prove to myself. Like if I kissed her deeply enough, I could silence the questions building in my chest. But now, with morning stretching across the room and reality slowly stitching itself back together, all I felt was the sharp ache of clarity. I couldn't pretend I didn't feel it. The weight of what we'd done sat like a stone in my stomach, warm and heavy and impossible to ignore. And yet, beneath the guilt and confusion, there was something else, an ember still glowing faintly, waiting for more air. She shifted slightly, and my body tensed in response. I closed my eyes instinctively, pretending to be asleep too, afraid to see what her face might look like. Was it regret, indifference, or something worse, something kind? The kindness would break me, because if she looked at me with softness, if she reached for me again with gentleness, I didn't know if I could survive it. I was too raw, too unsure, too close to unraveling. Time moved strangely in that room. Minutes felt like hours, stretching thin and snapping back all at once. I could hear voices from the hallway, the clinking of dishes being collected from room service trays, the occasional laugh of another guest. The world was continuing without us, and we were suspended in the in-between. No longer who we were before the wedding, but not yet anything else. Just two women in a bed, facing opposite directions, with skins still warm from touch and hearts beating out of sync. Eventually, she sat up. The sheet fell from her back, revealing the curve of her spine and the familiar freckle just below her shoulder blade. I wanted to reach out, to trace it with my fingers, to pull her back into the quiet warmth we'd created for a single night. But I didn't move. I watched through half-lidded eyes as she stood, gathered her robe, and crossed the room barefoot. Her movements were calm, unhurried, as if she were moving through a house she'd lived in for years, as if she had done nothing the night before that might break us. She disappeared into the bathroom, and the sound of the shower followed moments later, soft and rhythmic, like rain on a roof. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide what to feel. Was it a mistake? An experiment? A release of long-buried tension that would never be spoken of again? I didn't know. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. All I could do was remember how it felt when her body curled around mine like it belonged there, how her breath hitched when I kissed her collarbone, how my name sounded on her lips. When she returned, wrapped in a towel, hair damp and clinging to her neck, I sat up, pulling the sheet around myself like armor. We didn't look at each other for several seconds. The air between us was too full. She walked over to the vanity and began brushing her hair in slow, thoughtful strokes, as if everything were normal, as if she hadn't had her hands on my body hours ago. I watched her in the mirror, watched the way she avoided my reflection, watched the way her jaw clenched when she thought I wasn't looking. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words dried in my throat like old paper. What could I possibly say? Thank you? I'm sorry? Do you regret it? Do you want more? Each phrase felt too small or too large, too risky. So I sat in silence, picking at the corner of the sheet, my skin still humming from memories I wasn't ready to file away. She finished getting ready, moving around the room like a shadow, and I remained on the bed, unmoving, unraveling. We packed our bags without comment. She folded her clothes carefully, like she always had, and I shoved mine into my suitcase with less care, more urgency. I didn't want to look at her hands. I didn't want to remember how they felt. Every sound, the zip of a bag, the click of a clasp, the tap of her shoes on the tile, felt too loud in the stillness. My ears rang with all the things we didn't say. My body ached in places I couldn't name. We checked out side by side, just as we had checked in, but something between us had shifted. We looked like we had always looked, two women, friends, travelers, but I could feel the fracture widening with every step. I saw the way her shoulders were set, the way her smile was a little too careful when the front desk clerk handed her the receipt. She handed me my coffee without a word, and our fingers touched briefly. I flinched. So did she. As we walked toward the car, I stared at the back of her head, at the way her hair swayed slightly with each step. I wondered if she was thinking about the night like I was. I wondered if she felt the same knot in her chest, the same longing tangled with shame, the same hope bruised by silence. I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door, the click loud and final. She turned the key in the ignition, and the engine started with a low hum. We drove away from the hotel in silence. The wedding was over. The pretending had ended. But the feeling, the echo of skin on skin, breath against breath, hearts stumbling into rhythm, hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, lodged deep inside me, pulsing softly with every mile that took us farther from the night we couldn't name and the morning we couldn't escape. Back home, everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt familiar. The walls of my apartment still held their usual stillness, the furniture sat where I had left it, but the space vibrated with something unspoken. The silence no longer comforted me the way it used to. It echoed. It reminded me of her laugh against the hotel pillows, the shape of her body in the faint morning light, the warmth we hadn't discussed but both felt. I moved through the rooms like a visitor, picking up objects just to set them back down again. I tried to busy myself with laundry and unopened mail, but every folded shirt and paper envelope reminded me of her fingers, her lips, her weight on top of mine. She texted me 2 days later as if nothing had happened. Just a line, light and teasing, about how the wedding guests wouldn't stop messaging her, asking when we were getting married. I stared at the screen for too long, torn between laughing and crying. My response came slower than usual, more measured. I typed and deleted at least 6 different versions of the same bland sentence before finally settling on something neutral. She responded immediately with a string of emojis and a photo of her cat curled up in a laundry basket. It should have felt normal. It didn't. A week later, she called and asked if I wanted to spend the weekend together. No mention of the wedding, no mention of the hotel, just her voice, casual and bright, like we hadn't crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I said yes before I could stop myself. When she arrived, everything clicked into place too easily. She brought her overnight bag like it had always belonged in my hallway. She kicked off her shoes without asking, curled up on my couch without hesitation. I made tea, and she wandered into the kitchen behind me like she knew where everything was. And the strange part was, she did. That first night back under the same roof was uneventful in all the ways it shouldn't have been. We watched a movie, shared snacks, fell asleep on the couch with her legs draped over mine. Nothing overtly intimate, yet everything tinged with something electric. When I shifted beneath her to get comfortable, her arm stayed resting on my hip longer than necessary. When I yawned and stood to stretch, she followed me to the bedroom wordlessly. We didn't talk about sleeping arrangements. We just moved in rhythm, a choreography born of familiarity and something deeper. In bed, we lay side by side in the dark, our arms not quite touching. I could feel the heat of her, the shape of her body outlined against the sheets. My eyes were fixed on the ceiling, but my entire focus was trained on her breathing. It was slower than mine, more controlled, like she was holding something back. I turned slightly, just enough to see the curve of her jaw in the faint light from the street lamp outside. She didn't move. I didn't speak. But the space between us pulsed like a bruise. Eventually, I gave in. My hand reached out, hesitant at first, then more certain as my fingers found hers under the blanket. She didn't flinch. She laced them together. It was such a simple act, but it hit me like a flood. All the restraint of the past week, all the pretending that what happened had been a fluke, melted in the warmth of her palm. My breath caught, and I felt her shift closer, not enough to touch entirely, just enough to erase doubt. When our bodies finally connected, it was slow and deliberate. She rolled toward me, her knee brushing mine, her forehead resting lightly against my temple. There was no urgency, no rush to strip away layers, just hands exploring slowly, rediscovering terrain we already knew but hadn't yet claimed. Her lips brushed mine like a question, and I answered with the kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission. I pulled her close, letting her settle into the curve of my body, and this time, nothing about it felt like a lie. Her shirt came off first, then mine, the fabric whispering across skin like confession. She pressed her chest to mine, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We moved together without needing words, as if the silence between us had always held this shape. Her mouth traced the lines of my collarbone, the dip between my breasts, the edge of my ribs. My fingers tangled in her hair, my legs parted instinctively, and I felt her hips align with mine like two puzzle pieces finally pressed into place. She took her time. Every kiss felt deliberate. Every touch was measured but intense, like she was memorizing me in fragments. Her mouth moved down my stomach, her hands anchoring my thighs as she knelt between them. I moaned her name without thinking, my hips rising to meet her tongue, my fingers curling against the sheets. I shattered in silence, eyes squeezed shut, every muscle singing with release. And when I finally opened them, she was watching me, eyes dark, lips glistening, breathing hard. We didn't speak afterward. We just lay there, skin damp, limbs tangled, hearts thudding unevenly against one another. I listened to the ticking of the clock on the wall and realized how far we had come from pretending. This wasn't a role anymore. This was something real, terrifying and thrilling, and I didn't know how to hold it without breaking. I buried my face in her neck, breathed her in, and tried to hold still in a world that had started spinning too fast. Sometime later, she fell asleep in my arms. I stayed awake, watching her chest rise and fall, fingers tracing idle patterns across her back. Her presence no longer felt like a guest's, it felt like a claim. I was no longer sure where my life ended and hers began. And in that fragile moment, wrapped in borrowed comfort and heat, I began to understand that whatever came next would no longer be performance. It would be consequence. And I didn't know if I was ready, but I knew I wouldn't stop it. The following days blurred into one another like colors left to bleed on wet canvas. She didn't leave after the weekend. She stayed. Her toothbrush appeared next to mine without ceremony. Her jacket took up permanent residence on the back of my dining chair. She made coffee in the mornings before I even opened my eyes, humming softly in the kitchen while I listened from bed, the smell of toast and warmth drifting into the sheets. Our lives began folding into each other with no formal agreement, no declarations, just presence. We didn't define anything. We didn't talk about what we were doing, about what it meant, or what it was becoming. But we were everywhere in each other's lives now. Her keys were on my counter, my socks were on her feet. Our routines blended like the slow pouring of cream into coffee, separate at first, then indistinguishable. She called me from the store to ask what kind of cereal I liked. I folded her laundry while mine dried. It was domestic, unspoken, terrifying. And yet, at night, everything sharpened. The air between us grew electric again as the sun dipped below the blinds. Her body would find mine without hesitation, without theatrics. Fingers tracing lines only we understood. Lips pressing softly at first, then hungrier, more demanding. Skin to skin, the rest of the world fell away. She knew how to touch me in silence. She learned the rhythm of my breath like a song she was writing with her own hands. Each time we made love, it felt like the first time again. There was something tentative in it, like we were still asking permission without words. She kissed my shoulders, my stomach, the curve of my hip with reverence, with patience, with a kind of curiosity that never faded. My hands memorized her back, her thighs, the shape of her mouth when it opened against mine. I learned her sighs, her hesitations, the way her voice caught when I whispered her name. The sheets held our weight, our scent, the imprints of our limbs intertwined like ivy. Afterwards, we would lay still, tangled in the quiet aftermath. Sometimes she would rest her head against my chest, listening to my heartbeat slow. Other times, I would press my mouth to the curve of her neck and breathe her in like medicine. We rarely spoke during those moments. The silence between us was thick, rich, meaningful. There were too many words, and none of them would have been enough. But in daylight, tension crept back in like a shadow under the door. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, unsettling, a reminder that we were pretending not to fall into something that already surrounded us. She would reach for her phone a little more often. I would linger longer in the shower. We kept up the routine, but it was starting to feel like walking a narrow beam, balancing love and fear in equal weight. I wondered if she felt the same crack forming beneath our shared softness. One afternoon, I watched her dance around the living room, hair wet from the shower, socks sliding on the wood floors, music playing from her phone. She looked so light, so free, so entirely herself. And something in my chest tightened. I loved her. Not just her body, not just her presence. I loved the way she made space for me, the way she smiled when I handed her a cup of tea, the way her voice softened when she said my name in the quiet. But I hadn't said the words aloud. I didn't know if I was allowed to. She never asked what we were, not directly, but her eyes did. When we sat on the couch and she leaned into me, when she reached for my hand while we watched some dumb show, when she looked at me in the soft blue light of the TV and let her thumb brush my knuckles. Her body asked questions, her mouth didn't. My body answered them in kind. But the silence between skin and speech was beginning to strain. I started noticing small shifts. She stopped sleeping on her side of the bed. She curled into me more often, her arm thrown around my waist, her breath warm on the back of my neck. She left little things on purpose, chapstick, earrings, books she never picked back up. It felt intentional, like nesting, like settling into a life that hadn't yet asked for permission to exist. One night, after we had made love slowly and deeply, I rolled over and looked at her. Her face was half hidden in the pillow, her eyes open, watching me. The room was quiet, the hum of the heater the only sound. I wanted to speak, to say something real, something grounding, something brave, but my throat closed. And instead, I reached for her hand and held it tightly until I fell asleep. I started writing about her in my journal. Little things. The shape of her smile when she caught me looking, the way she cracked her knuckles before getting out of bed, how she always smelled like a mix of citrus and something I could never name. I wrote to remember, to hold on to the way this felt before I found a way to ruin it. I wasn't afraid of her leaving. I was afraid of deserving her and still losing her, of saying too much or not enough, of naming something so delicate it shattered in my mouth. And every time she pressed her lips to mine, I wondered if she knew, if she could feel the words hiding beneath my skin to skin, word to word. And yet, we said nothing. Still. The morning she left, the apartment didn't feel empty right away. It still held the echo of her footsteps, the faint hum of her laugh, the way she always sang under her breath when she made coffee. Her scent lingered in the hallway like a whisper that refused to fade. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a corner of the comforter she had pulled over herself just the night before, and tried to make sense of the silence. It wasn't quiet. It was abandoned. There had been no fight, no dramatic scene, just a quiet unraveling stretched across several days, like a thread slowly pulled from a sweater until all that was left was a pile of fabric and a feeling of loss. She had started leaving earlier in the mornings, coming home later, smiling less. The warmth of her touch cooled to something cautious, polite. She stopped reaching for me in the dark. I stopped asking her to. I found the note on the kitchen table, next to her mug. No apology, no explanation, just a folded piece of paper that smelled faintly of her perfume. I didn't open it right away. I held it in my hand like a wound, feeling its weight, knowing whatever was inside would change something in me. When I finally unfolded it, the words were neat, careful, too restrained to be honest. She said she needed time. She said it wasn't about me. She said she didn't know how to be in something she never expected to begin. I sat at the table long after I read it. Her chair was pushed back slightly, as if she had gotten up mid-thought. The coffee pot was empty. The sink was dry. Her absence had weight, shape, intention. I reached for her mug, still warm from her hands, and held it like it could tell me something she hadn't. But it was just ceramic, hollow. Over the next few days, I moved through the apartment like a ghost wearing my own clothes. I did the things I had always done, laundry, groceries, checking the mail, but everything felt performative, like I was playing a part I no longer remembered the lines for. Her pillow still held the indent of her head. Her robe still hung on the back of the bathroom door. I told myself I would wash it, but I didn't. I needed to preserve the trace of her. I replayed everything in my mind, as if there had been a moment I could freeze and rewind and fix. The way she looked at me after the wedding, the mornings we made love in silence, the day she said nothing at all but sat with her head on my lap for hours. I searched for signs I had missed. Maybe there were too many. Maybe I had just chosen not to see them. Or maybe love like this wasn't meant to survive past pretending. One night, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and found the hair tie she always used, the one with the loose thread and faint scent of lavender. I held it to my face and let the ache in my chest collapse me forward, my elbows on my knees, my breath shaking. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. There were no tears left, just a dry kind of grief that coated everything I touched. Eventually, I cleaned out the drawer she had been using. I folded her clothes with deliberate care, pausing at each item as though waiting for it to ask me not to. A t-shirt, a pair of leggings, a sleep shirt she used to wear when it got cold. I pressed them to my chest before placing them in a box. I didn't know what to do with the box. I left it by the door and avoided looking at it every time I passed. She didn't return my messages. I didn't send many, just a few soft lines spaced out over a week, each one more fragile than the last. I told her I hoped she was okay, that the plant she loved was still alive, that the apartment was too quiet. I never said I missed her. I didn't need to. The silence between us was loud enough. One afternoon, I went to the grocery store and instinctively reached for the kind of oat milk she liked, even though I didn't drink it. I stood there for a full minute, staring at it in my hand before putting it back. In that moment, I realized something had changed in me that couldn't be undone. I had let her in too deeply, and now every corner of my life bore the outline of her. Weeks passed, then a month. The ache dulled, but it didn't disappear. I started sleeping with the window open again. I stopped checking my phone as often. I moved her robe to the back of the closet, but I didn't throw it out. Some mornings, I would wake up and feel her absence like a second spine, something woven into me, heavy and unshakable. One evening, I came home and caught a trace of her perfume still clinging to the collar of a sweater I hadn't worn since she left. It stunned me. It wasn't strong, barely there, but it undid something in me I thought had healed. I stood in the hallway, clutching the fabric, my breath caught in my throat, and knew that this was the kind of ending that doesn't end. There would be no closure, no final conversation. Just this, quiet rooms, echoing footsteps, and the scent of her perfume tucked into the seams of a life we had almost shared. Some loves aren't lost loudly. Some slip out the door in the early morning with a note and a still warm coffee mug, leaving behind only memory and the undeniable proof that they were once real.